Lincoln, but realized that he was just going to shoot him. It was easier. And that's actually how it came about. And so I don't think most people know that whole backstory of how it was actually a pretty elaborate plot to try and kidnap Lincoln when he was out riding. And that raises the whole question of what was the security like? I mean, we're used to presidents having helicopter gunships fly over them when they travel in their motorcades and so on. And Lincoln actually did travel about with pretty minimal security by any modern understanding of it. He did have military escorts a lot of the times, but a lot of times he didn't. And it wasn't until about a year before his death, that he was riding out again towards Forest Home, and a marksman took a shot at him and shot his famous hat off his head. And there was no more riding about by himself after that. So Booth didn't really know that. He didn't know a lot of stuff. He didn't have very good intelligence. And from that point on, Lincoln was almost always accompanied with at least a couple of soldiers, a military escort.
Well, that gets us into the interesting world of both Confederate conspiracies and John Wilkes Booth. Let me start with John Wilkes Booth and then talk about Confederate conspiracy theories. I spoke with another author on this podcast, and he mentioned that John Wilkes Booth was the most famous actor of his day. He was the George Clooney, Brad Pitt, Leo DiCaprio, Justin Bieber, whatever your generation is. He was that. Very famous in theater, very much a ladies' man, and he pinned what John Wilkes Booth did on syphilis. He said that the way that he behaved up to the time of the assassination was uncharacteristic compared to his earlier life. So it was almost a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde scenario. So I'm curious in this aspect too. And then that also opens us up to the world of Confederate conspiracies. Were they trying to assassinate or kidnap Lincoln at the very beginning of the war? Do they have other attempts? And when does John Wilkes Booth enter this world? Because for a famous actor to be caught into this plot, it sounds like the movie Zoolander, where a male model is...
Yes.
Which I'm glad you recognize that, because I mentioned that to the other guest and he didn't know the movie, so I was heartbroken.
Well, I have kids, so...
Yeah. Hey everyone, Scott here. We're going to take a very short break for a word from our sponsors.
That's a lot of stuff to go into. First of all, I don't buy the syphilis story. I mean, I could see why somebody might say that, because actually Booth was a little bit madcap his entire life. I mean, his mother was worried about him always. She was scared that something would happen to her beloved child, because he was known for his impetuous behavior and for doing dangerous stunts and things like that. He was a reckless guy. And what's amazing about Booth is he was very beloved. It wasn't just that he was the most famous actor in America. That's a bit of a stretch. He was competing. He was like, Brad Pitt, George Clooney, one of those guys. There were a couple of people that were trying to be the most famous actor. He probably made about $500,000 a year in his acting at the time, which was, in our terms, which was a good salary. He was doing very, very well. He was famous, and people loved him. He was considered one of the kindest, nicest people. Even after the assassination, his friends continued to sing his praises, and what a great fellow he was, when it was very dangerous to do that. I mean, they were talking about the assassin of the president of the United States, and yet they said out loud that he was one of the nicest guys they've ever met. He was kind to children and animals and all that stuff, and they just couldn't believe he would do this. And he was always a person of political passions. He was always an extremist. He always said whatever was on his mind. If I have a theory of what he was, I would say we would call him today maybe bipolar. A lot of actors allegedly are afflicted with bipolar disease. They can be afflicted with a mania, kind of depression and then mania. And that's what was more fit what Booth was like. He was a manic person that would get these crazy ideas and run with them. But he was intensely loyal. He did have friends who were supporters of the Union who took him in stride and so on. So he was a very, very interesting character. And what I love about doing history and stuff and going back is you can read some of his thoughts. I mean, The collective writings of John Wilkes Booth are available, and he was a horrible speller, and but he did write down his thoughts. He did write a kind of a political manifesto a couple of years before the assassination, and which became the basis of a manifesto that he had released to an actor friend on the day of the assassination that was never published. It was burned because the guy knew it might implicate him. So he was scared to death when he actually read it after the assassination. So he burned it. He burned this manifesto, just like assassins do today, where they publish their manifestos on Facebook. Booth had this manifesto, an explanation of what he was about to do, that he wanted printed in the newspaper. And this fellow agreed to get it to the editors. He didn't know what was in it. And when after the assassination, he read it and was just scared to death. He thought he'd be arrested and implicated as part of the conspiracy and maybe hung. So he burned it, actually in the Peterson guest house where Lincoln was dying downstairs. And that manifesto he claimed to be able to remember later from memory. And it was very similar to a published account of another manifesto that was found among Booth's effects a couple years after his death, and that was published in the newspapers and only modified slightly. So anyway, he was an extreme fellow from the very beginning, but much beloved. And so I don't think we could simply say it was a result of syphilis or something like that. It was part of his personality that he had growing up and was always like that.
To look at the Confederacy, I think I heard somewhere that there was an earlier assassination plot against Lincoln. Are they always planning this? Do they have Confederate commando teams that are the SEAL Team 6 of the Confederacy thinking, how can we nab Lincoln?
Well, that's another part of the backstory that people don't realize. The Confederacy did look into at least kidnapping Lincoln. And that's why some of the people that advocate, like the historian Edward Steers and so on, advocate that the Confederacy was involved in this, is because there's evidence that they did look into it. There was Confederate agents went to Washington to case the place, basically, to see if it was feasible. And he concluded that there was no way to do it, that Lincoln this was a professional, intelligence officer, and he concluded that Lincoln was too well guarded, that they couldn't pull it off. And see, that's the thing is, John Wilkes Booth was a maniac actor with delusions of grandeur who wanted to do something for the South. He had no military training at all, except for one brief stint in a Virginia militia for 2 weeks, where he, it was more of a lark than anything. He had no training. None of his co-conspirators had really any military or intelligence training at the end. Some of the early conspirators in the kidnapping plot had some, but so this guy really didn't know what he was doing. So when the professional intelligence agents of the Confederacy looked into kidnapping Lincoln, they decided it wasn't feasible. But there was some truth to the fact that things got much nastier towards the end of the war. There were atrocities on both sides. There was something called the Dahlgren raid. I don't know if you know about that, where the Union was going to attempt to free some prisoners of war being held in Confederate prisons, and there was this raid that was going to go into Richmond. And one of the leaders of the raid, the fellow named Dahlgren, Ulrich Dahlgren was shot. And when they got his body, they found on it orders that seemed to suggest that they were to go into the Capitol and kill Jefferson Davis, which at the time was considered a violation of the laws of war. I'm not an expert in military law, or the law of warfare, so I can't debate whether it actually was a violation of the laws of war, but it was taken that way. And they took photographs of these documents. The Confederacy, they sent them to newspapers all over the country. It was a big deal. And as a result, guerrilla raids and more, more desperate measures began to be taken on both sides. There were atrocities on both sides. The Confederacy decided to engage in the first act that we know of biological warfare, in that they tried to ship some blankets with smallpox on them into the North and things like that. So once the Dahlgren raid happened, the kind of chivalry aspect of the Civil War was set aside, and things got to be much more ruthless in a sense. So that kind of fuels some of the Confederacy conspiracy theories that the Confederacy was involved. I don't think they were, because it was such at the end, it was Keystone Cops time. These guys, John Wilkes Booth and his madcap band of followers, his 4 or 5 impoverished fellows who were following him, they would show up to kidnap Lincoln, and he wouldn't even be there. Their intelligence was so bad, they clearly didn't know what they were doing. If the Confederacy really was involved, I think it would have been a much more professional operation, and it would have been much more successful than it was. So that's my personal belief.
You're right, and it doesn't make sense to choose John Wilkes Booth unless we truly are operating on Zoolander logic, that actors and models can enter exclusive places. But that falls into the dumb conspiracy theories. Like, I've heard that, well, Bruce Lee didn't really die. He went to be an undercover cop with the Hong Kong police. And I thought, yes, you would choose the most famous actor on earth for undercover work. That makes a lot of sense. So.
Yes. Well, that's true. But, I mean, the reason these conspiracy theories have some followers often is because there's a kernel of truth in some of them. There were Confederate agents that were among Booth's earliest team of kidnappers. John Surratt Jr. was a actual courier. There were a couple of other people that had said, yes, they'll help with the plot to kidnap Lincoln, who were actual honest to God agents of the Confederacy. But it appears that they were just kind of helping out a little bit, and they weren't actually acting under orders from Richmond, as they would say. And that's kind of my take, what I've been able to sort out from reading these firsthand accounts.
Well, I'm curious about this group that does follow John Wilkes Booth, and who are they? What reasons do they have to join him to be led by someone who has no ability whatsoever to execute something like this? And does the objective change? Because I think you mentioned it changed from kidnapping to assassination. So why did it change, and what was this group like?
Well, as I said, there was actually 2 components to the conspiracy to kidnap Lincoln. At first, Booth was able to convince a few serious, legitimate people to join him, like John Surratt, who was a courier, and a couple other people. So there was a bigger conspiracy to kidnap Lincoln, and they thought it was a crazy plan, but my God, it just might work. And these were desperate times. And if they actually could nab Lincoln on one of his nightly jaunts around Washington, D.C. on his horse, it was plausible, at least in the earliest stages, that they might be able to negotiate some sort of prisoner release or something like that. It was a crazy plan, but they were desperate men at this time, and they thought, it's at least worth exploring. But very quickly, that sort of after so many false attempts and false promises, and when it became increasingly clear that John Wilkes Booth had no idea what he was doing, the serious people dropped out, and he was only left with a handful of, as I said, desperate people who just needed money, and like George Azerodt and so on, who was an impoverished German immigrant, and at that point, these people just were loyal to him because he was rich and famous, and they would do whatever he said. And he told them that they would get hundreds of thousands of dollars. They'd become wealthier beyond their imaginations because he lied, I think. In my opinion, he lied and promised them there'd be this big reward from the Confederacy when the Confederacy wasn't actually actively involved at all. But that's how he kept the handful of people with him until the end, by promising big financial rewards, and because they were desperate, impoverished people who literally didn't know where their next meal was coming from. In the earlier stages, though, there were some more serious Confederate sympathizers who were involved. As for when did Booth decide to kill Lincoln, that is a big question, and some people say that he did not have that intention until as late as April 11th or so, when Lincoln made a speech